USS Pennsylvania was a legendary battleship that served during both World Wars. From surviving the attack on Pearl Harbor to providing fire support throughout the Pacific Theater, the Pennsylvania's story is one of resilience. She served as the flagship of first the Atlantic Fleet, and after it was merged with the Pacific Fleet in 1921, the Battle Fleet. In this role, many legendary admirals broke their flags in her, as did several presidents. After receiving significant damage from a torpedo strike in the waning days of World War II, she was regulated to a test ship during the post-war atomic tests at Bikini Atoll. Pennsylvania received 8 battle stars and a Presidential Unit Citation for her World War II service. Pennsylvania's keel was laid down on October 27, 1913, at the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Newport News, Virginia, and she was launched in March of 1915. She had an overall length of 608 feet, a beam of 97 feet, and had a standard displacement of over 29,000 tons. Pennsylvania was equipped with a main battery of 12 14-inch 45 caliber guns, which were housed in 4 triple turrets. She had a super-firing pair forward and another super-firing pair on her aft end. Her guns could not elevate independently, though, and were limited to a maximum elevation of 15 degrees. This gave her main battery a maximum range of 21,000 yards. Her secondary battery consisted of 22 5-inch 51 caliber guns mounted in individual casemates along the sides of her hull and main deck. They proved very vulnerable to sea spray, though, and were useless in anything other than calm seas. The ship mounted 4 3-inch 50 caliber guns for air defense, although only 2 were fitted by the time she was commissioned. The other 2 were added shortly afterward to the roof of Turret 3. And like all U.S. battle wagons of this era, Pennsylvania also sported 2 21-inch torpedo tubes, which were located below her waterline, one on each broadside, and she carried 24 torpedoes for them. Pennsylvania continued the all-or-nothing principle of armoring only the most important areas of the ship, which was begun in the preceding Nevada class. Her main belt was 13.5 inches thick and covered the ship's machinery spaces and magazines. Her deck armor was 3 inches thick, but rose to 6.25 over her steering gear. Pennsylvania's turret faces were protected by 18 inches of armor, while the sides were 9 to 10 inches thick, and her turret roofs were protected by another 5 inches. Her barbettes were protected by 18 inches of armor. Pennsylvania was powered by 12 oil-fired boilers, which generated steam for 4 direct-drive steam turbines, which in turn drove 4 shafts. Rated for 34,000 shaft horsepower, Pennsylvania had a top speed of 21 knots and a cruising range of 7,500 nautical miles at 12 knots. At the time of her commissioning, she was manned by 1,159 officers and enlisted men. Pennsylvania was commissioned into the fleet on June 12, 1916, and assigned to the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. She spent the remaining summer months undergoing sea trials and then fleet exercises off the eastern seaboard. In October, she became the flagship of the Atlantic Fleet when Rear Admiral Henry T. Mayo broke his flag. She continued training into the new year and was anchored within the confines of the Chesapeake Bay on April 6th, when war was officially declared against Germany. Pennsylvania did not sail to join the British Grand Fleet, though, as she burned fuel oil and tankers could not be spared to carry additional fuel to the British Isles. In light of this circumstance, and given that coal was plentiful in the British Isles, only the older coal-burning battleships were selected for deployment to European waters. Pennsylvania and her crew maintained their combat readiness by conducting various fleet exercises and gunnery practices throughout the training areas of Chesapeake Bay and Long Island Sound during 1918, and this would end up being the extent of Pennsylvania's involvement in the First World War. On Armistice Day, November 11, 1918, Pennsylvania conducted a night battle practice off the coast of New York, before spending the rest of the month undergoing routine maintenance at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. She got underway on December 4th for Brest, France, and at 11 o'clock that morning, she met the troop transport George Washington, who was flying the flag of the President of the United States. Pennsylvania's crew manned the rail and fired a 21-gun salute. She then took position ahead of George Washington as guide for the President's trip to France. The convoy reached France on December 13th, and her sailors manned the rail and cheered as George Washington passed and proceeded to her anchorage. The following day, Pennsylvania, along with the battleships that had been deployed to Europe during the war, got underway for New York, where they arrived to much fanfare on December 26th. The early interwar years found Pennsylvania conducting exercises and training off the U.S. East Coast. She transited the Panama Canal and maneuvered with units of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in January 1921, at which time she was formally designated as the flagship of the newly created combined U.S. battle fleet. Pennsylvania spent the rest of the 1920s conducting training, maintenance, and port visits, mostly along the Pacific coast, with the occasional foray into the Atlantic for participation in the annual fleet problems. Pennsylvania participated in Fleet Problem 9 during early 1929, before heading to the Philadelphia Navy Yard for a major overhaul and modernization in June. She remained in the yard for nearly 2 years, during which she received additional deck and turret roof armor, as well as a torpedo bulge on each side of her hull, which broadened her beam to 106 feet and 3 inches, which was the maximum allowable for passage through the locks of the Panama Canal. In addition to new turbo generators, the installation of 6 new 3-drum boilers and turbines upgraded her power plant. Her main battery saw an increase in elevation to 30 degrees, which in turn increased their maximum range to 34,000 yards. Her secondary battery was reduced to 12 5-inch 51 caliber guns, and her 3-inch anti-aircraft guns were replaced by 8 5-inch 25 caliber guns, and her torpedo tubes were removed. Tripod masts mounting fire control installations and fighting tops replaced the lattice masts. Her bridge was enlarged and modernized to reflect her role as a fleet flagship, and her crew space was increased to allow for 2,037 sailors and Marines. Pennsylvania also received 2 catapults for observation aircraft. Pennsylvania returned to service on March 1, 1931, and after completing her sea trials during March and April, she departed in May for refresher training off Guantanamo Bay. She passed through the Panama Canal on August 12th and officially rejoined the fleet on August 27th. During the rest of the 1930s, Pennsylvania operated mostly off the West Coast and in Hawaiian waters under a routine schedule of training and periodic maintenance. She made the occasional foray into the Atlantic as well, for fleet problems and fleet reviews. She remained the flagship of the battle force during most of this time as well. Fleet Problem 22 in 1941 was canceled as a result of tensions in the Pacific between the U.S. and Japan, and on January 7th, Pennsylvania sailed for Hawaii to become part of the newly redesignated U.S. Pacific Fleet. Now based at Pearl Harbor, Pennsylvania spent the rest of the year carrying out scheduled operations with the units of Task Forces 1 and 5. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Pennsylvania was in Dry Dock No. 1 in the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, where she was undergoing a refit. 3 of her 4 screws were removed at the time. The destroyers Cassin and Downs were also in the dry dock with her. When it became clear that Pearl Harbor was under attack, Pennsylvania's crew rushed to their battle stations and began engaging the attackers just after 8 a.m. Japanese torpedo bombers unsuccessfully attempted to torpedo the side of the dry dock to flood it. These attempts ultimately failed. Fighters then began savagely strafing Pennsylvania. Just after 9 a.m., several high-altitude bombers began a series of attacks on the ships in the dry dock, and over the course of the following 15 minutes, 5 aircraft attempted to hit Pennsylvania from multiple directions. 1 bomb struck Downs and another struck the starboard side of the dry dock, and then a third struck Pennsylvania on her boat deck a few feet aft of 5-inch gun number 7. The bomb passed through the boat deck and detonated inside casemate number 9. The dry dock was then flooded around 9:20 in an effort to quench the fires raging around the destroyers and to prevent catastrophic damage from happening to Pennsylvania. But at 9:30, explosions on the destroyers began to take place, and at 9:41, ammunition on downs exploded and covered the area with debris. A section of a torpedo tube weighing between 500 and 1,000 pounds was blown onto Pennsylvania's forecastle. In short order, her crew, utilizing the ship's motor launches, took action to replenish her ammunition from West Lock, and by 2 o'clock that afternoon, work began on repairing her bomb damage. The severely damaged West Virginia provided Pennsylvania with 2 5-inch mounts to replace the ones that had been damaged during the attack. Less than a week later, Pennsylvania was refloated and got underway on December 20th for San Francisco, where she arrived on the 29th. Pennsylvania entered the dry dock at Hunter's Point on January 1st for permanent repairs. After her battle damage was repaired, she was overhauled in February at the Mare Island Navy Yard. This overhaul focused on strengthening her anti-aircraft capabilities as she received 4 1.1mm 75 caliber quad mounts, and her 50 caliber machine guns were replaced by 16 20mm Oerlikon autocannons. Splinter shields were also added to her 5-inch 25 cal mounts. From late February until August 1, 1942, Pennsylvania conducted extensive training operations and patrols along the coast of California with Task Force 1. Pennsylvania shifted back to Pearl Harbor in mid-August. She conducted gunnery exercises and training in Hawaiian waters until early October, when she returned to San Francisco for a major overhaul and modernization at the Mare Island Navy Yard. It was during this overhaul that Pennsylvania's profile was dramatically altered, as afterwards she resembled the new fast battleship South Dakota, who was the inspiration for the work done to her. Her bridge was reconfigured, and her conning tower was removed, and a long-based rangefinder was mounted in its place. Her tripod mainmast was also removed and replaced by a deckhouse above which the aft main battery director was housed, and a new CXA-M1 radar was installed just forward of this. Her older 5-inch guns that remained in casemates and her 5-inch anti-aircraft guns were replaced with dual-purpose 5-inch 38 caliber guns in 8 twin-barreled turrets, which were located amidships, 4 on each broadside. These could elevate to 85 degrees and fire at a rate of 1 round every 4 seconds. Her 1.1 quad mounts were replaced with 10 Bofors 40mm quad mounts, and her Oerlikon mounts were increased significantly to 51 single mounts. Pennsylvania also received new fire control directors and fire control radars. She remained in the San Francisco area until February 1943, when she shifted to Southern California waters to conduct refresher training, before undertaking a series of battle practices, which lasted into April, in preparation for her upcoming operations. Pennsylvania arrived at Cold Bay, Alaska on April 30, 1943. From May 11th through the 12th, she bombarded Attu Island in support of U.S. landings there. As she retired that evening, a PBY Catalina warned that a torpedo was heading for her. Pennsylvania maneuvered at full speed as the torpedo passed astern, and 2 of her escorting destroyers, Edwards and Farragut, hauled out of formation to hunt the attacker down. On the afternoon of May 14th, Pennsylvania conducted her 3rd bombardment mission, this time in support of an infantry attack on the western side of Holt's Bay. She then operated to the north and east of Attu until the 19th, when she set course for Adak. Soon afterwards, an explosion occurred in her gasoline stowage compartment, which caused structural damage but no casualties. She departed Adak on the 21st and arrived at the Puget Sound Navy Yard 1 week later, on the 28th. She entered the dry dock and underwent an overhaul, during which time she experienced a second gasoline explosion that killed 1 sailor and injured another. Pennsylvania returned to Alaskan waters on August 7th, and on August 15th, she pounded the beaches of western Kiska Island before assault troops landed. By the evening of the 16th, it had become apparent that the Japanese had evacuated the island prior to the landing, She then patrolled the Kiska area until late August. Pennsylvania arrived in Hawaiian waters on October 6th to conduct bombardment exercises ahead of upcoming amphibious invasions scheduled in the Central Pacific. She became the flagship for Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner, commander of the 5th Amphibious Force, and was a part of the Northern Attack Force that departed Pearl Harbor on November 10th for the assault on Bikini Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. The task force approached Macon from the southeast on the morning of November 20th. Pennsylvania opened fire with her main battery before unleashing her secondary battery as she moved in closer. Pennsylvania provided fire support as the battle raged over the next 2 days. Japanese torpedo planes conducted a series of intense air attacks on the nights of November 25th and 26th, but the task force fought them off without suffering any casualties. On the 30th, Pennsylvania departed for Pearl Harbor, where she would reside until the new year. Pennsylvania got underway on January 22, 1944, and commenced her bombardment of Kwajalein Island on the 31st. Landings began the next day on February 1st, with Pennsylvania providing fire support to the troops ashore until the island was declared secure on the 3rd. That evening, Pennsylvania anchored in the lagoon near Kwajalein Island. On February 12th, Pennsylvania got underway for operations in the Marshall Islands. She shelled Japanese installations at Engebe on the 18th, before shifting her fire to Perry Island from the 21st to the 22nd. Pennsylvania's next action came at Saipan, which she shelled on June 14th. She cruised off the northeastern shore of Tinian the next day, where she pounded enemy shore batteries, which posed a threat to the landing beaches on Saipan. On the 16th, she shelled targets around Orotu Point on Guam. Pennsylvania departed the Marianas on June 25th, and after a brief stay in the Marshalls, she was back on July 9th to resume her support of the Marianas campaign. Pennsylvania participated in the bombardment of Guam during mid-July. In the early morning hours of the 21st, Pennsylvania took up a position between Agate Beach and the Orote Peninsula, and commenced a bombardment of the beach areas that were to be assaulted. She provided gunfire support for the troops ashore until August 3rd. She next took part in the intensive bombardment of the Palau Islands in mid-September, where she helped with the pre-invasion shore bombardments and fire support duties until steaming for emergency repairs at Seidler Harbor on September 25th. Pennsylvania departed Manus on October 12th in company with the other veteran battleships of Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf's Bombardment and Fire Support Group. On October 18th, she covered the underwater demolition teams and minesweeping units operating in Leyte Gulf and San Pedro Harbor. She then supported the landings on Leyte on the 20th, and her fire support missions, including night illumination fire, continued through the 22nd. Then, on the 24th, Pennsylvania and 5 other veteran battleships, including several of her fellow Pearl Harbor veterans, steamed south, and by nightfall were slowly steaming back and forth across the northern entrance of Surigao Strait. PT boats and destroyers first drove home their attacks in the southern part of Surigao Strait. Then, at 3:53 a.m., on October 25th, fellow Pearl Harbor vet West Virginia opened fire on what was left of the Japanese Southern Force, and was promptly joined by the other battleships and cruisers of the force. Rear Admiral Oldendorf had crossed the T and, using the superior radar fire control on 3 of the U.S. battle wagons, ravaged what was left of the Japanese force in the final chapter of the Battle of Surigao Strait. Unfortunately, Pennsylvania, who lacked the advanced radar that some of the other battleships had, was unable to find a target, and her gun crews never received orders to commence firing, and her guns remained silent through the entire action. Pennsylvania patrolled the Leyte area until November 25th, and during that time she used her bristling AA battery to protect smaller ships from a new emerging threat, the kamikaze. She was credited with downing at least 5 enemy planes and drove off many more while she was operating in the Leyte area. Pennsylvania came under heavy air attacks on the 4th and 5th of January as she neared Lingayen Gulf in the northern Philippines. On the morning of the 6th, she shelled Santiago Island at the mouth of Lingayen Gulf, and that afternoon she entered the Gulf to cover minesweeping activities. At daybreak on the 7th, the entire bombardment force began the pre-invasion shore bombardment, which continued until the 6th United States Army went ashore on the 9th. At that point, Pennsylvania switched to fire support duties, which culminated in her last fire support mission, when she fired 12 rounds to destroy a concentration of enemy tanks which had been located inland by a fire control party. Pennsylvania remained in the area until February 10th, when she sailed for temporary repairs at Manus. She departed for San Francisco on the 22nd and entered the Hunters Point Yard for a thorough overhaul in mid-March. Her main battery turrets and secondary battery mounts were regunned. Her anti-aircraft armament was increased to 71 Oerlikons in 27 single and 22 twin mounts, and an additional pair of Bofors guns in a twin mount was installed on top of Turret 2. Improved radar and fire control equipment was also installed. Upon the completion of her overhaul, Pennsylvania conducted sea trials, followed by refresher training before departing for Pearl Harbor in mid-July. After more gunnery practice in Hawaiian waters, she sailed for Okinawa on July 24th. While steaming to Okinawa, Pennsylvania took part in the bombardment of Wake Island on August 1st, during which a shell fragment from a near miss from Japanese counterfire disabled one of her 5-inch directors. Pennsylvania suffered no casualties, but then one of the ship's 2 Curtiss Seahawks lost its right wing float during a recovery in the heavy seas and capsized. After taking on ammunition at Saipan the next day, Pennsylvania resumed her voyage to Okinawa and dropped anchor in Buckner Bay alongside the battleship Tennessee on August 12th. Luck was not on her side during this voyage, though, or after she dropped anchor, as that evening a lone Japanese torpedo bomber managed to slip in undetected and struck Pennsylvania on the aft end of her starboard side near her number 1 shaft. The torpedo opened a hole approximately 30 feet in diameter, which caused her to take on a considerable amount of water, and she began to settle by the stern. Pennsylvania suffered extensive damage. 20 men were killed, and 10 more were injured. Excellent work by her damage control parties brought the flooding under control and saved her. The following day, she was towed to shallow water, where salvage operations were easier. Pennsylvania would be the last major U.S. warship damaged in World War II. She was still in Buckner Bay when word came on the 15th of the Japanese capitulation. Her steering gear and 3 of her shafts were severely damaged by the torpedo strike, so on the 18th, she was towed to Guam. Temporary repairs were effected. A large steel patch was welded over the torpedo hole, and repairs were made to permit her to return to the U.S. under her own power. On October 4th, she departed for the Puget Sound Navy Yard, but on the 17th, her number 3 shaft suddenly carried away and slipped aft, which necessitated divers being sent down to cut through the shaft, letting it and the propeller drop into the depths of the ocean. Shipping water, and with only 1 screw turning, Pennsylvania limped into the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard on October 24th. Pennsylvania was designated as an atomic bomb target on January 16, 1946. Repairs were made to enable her to steam to the Marshall Islands. She departed Puget Sound in late February, bound for the atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll. Test Able occurred on July 1st and consisted of an air detonation. Monitoring teams boarded Pennsylvania on July 2nd and determined that she was radiologically safe for her crew to return, which enabled her crew to live and work on board until the 24th, when the crew was removed again for Test Baker, a shallow underwater detonation, which took place the next day. Pennsylvania received negligible to minor physical damage, but was radiologically contaminated from the surge caused by the underwater explosion. On August 21st, the attack transport Niagara towed her to Kwajalein Lagoon, where she was decommissioned on August 29th. She remained there for radiological and structural studies until February 1948, when she was scuttled. Pennsylvania was stricken from the Naval Vessel Registry on February 19, 1948. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe so that we can bring you more content like this.